In 1863, Tennessee was a land fractured by war. Yet for some, it was a time of silent prosperity built on the backs of the unseen. While Union and Confederate forces clashed across battlefields and small towns, bore the scars of occupation, the Chamberlain family estate, Hollow Creek, remained largely untouched. Shielded by political allies and the confusion of war, the Chamberlains not only survived but thrived. Their wealth, tied to the cotton fields that stretched endlessly over the red earth, grew with each bale harvested and shipped under discreet arrangements with Northern textile mills and Confederate suppliers alike. War meant cotton was more precious than ever, and the Chamberlains knew how to maneuver in the shadows. Eldest son Silas Chamberlain, a man of cold precision, orchestrated the estate's operations with an eye for both politics and cruelty. He ensured the family's cotton bypassed blockades through a carefully maintained network of middlemen and smugglers, men who owed their fortunes and silence to Chamberlain gold. His father, Thaddeus Chamberlain, had laid the groundwork decades earlier, turning Hollow Creek into a self-contained kingdom. With his death in 1861, Silas inherited not only the land but also the blood-bound expectations to preserve the dynasty's power at any cost. The family home, a sprawling Greek Revival mansion with marble pillars imported from New Orleans and imported silk wallpapers from France, stood as a monument to excess. Visitors described the estate as a southern Versailles, with its gardens manicured by enslaved hands and its drawing rooms lit by imported chandeliers even during wartime shortages. Behind the grandeur, however, lay a brutal truth. Hollow Creek's wealth wasn't just grown in the soil, it was harvested from human suffering. More than 200 enslaved people worked the cotton fields, housed in cramped wooden cabins just out of sight of the main estate, living under the constant threat of punishment and death. It was during these years, under the guise of wartime secrecy, that the worst of the atrocities occurred. Disease and malnutrition spread rapidly in the slave quarters. Medical care was denied or delayed, seen as a luxury not worth investing in. As cotton demand grew, working hours lengthened and whippings increased. Some tried to escape. Few succeeded. Those who died, whether from fever, exhaustion, or punishment, were not given the dignity of marked graves. They were buried hastily in the woods near a dried creek bed, sometimes in pairs, sometimes without coffins. The bodies were placed in shallow earth, unrecorded and unremembered by anyone except their fellow enslaved. Over time, the unmarked graves would number 73. These deaths were never acknowledged by the Chamberlains in letters or ledgers. Silas ensured that their names were struck from any registry if they were ever recorded to begin with. To the family, they were losses in inventory, inconvenient, and replaceable. But within the quarters, the memories of those lost lived on through whispered stories, mourned at night by songs passed quietly among the enslaved, songs that carried names no one else would speak aloud. Not everyone in the Chamberlain household was blind to this cruelty. Miriam Chamberlain, the youngest daughter, was barely 17 and already burdened with a conscience that did not suit her bloodline. Unlike her brothers, who viewed the estate as a business to manage and an empire to expand, Miriam saw Hollow Creek for what it truly was, a gilded cage built on horror. She often wandered the estate's outer edges alone, sometimes standing in the woods near the unmarked graves, sensing but not fully understanding the enormity of what lay beneath her feet. The war had changed her. Letters from northern friends, hidden books, and stolen conversations with a literate housemaid named Ruth began to awaken in her a restless awareness. But within Hollow Creek, even awareness was dangerous. The Chamberlain fortune grew, even as the Confederate cause faltered. Profits soared, new land was purchased, even as other estates burned. And still the family never spoke of the deaths, the 73 silent testaments buried just beyond the reach of sunlight. Those graves remained hidden, covered by thick brush and silence. But graves, even unmarked, do not stay quiet forever. Beyond the polished marble floors of the Chamberlain estate and the illusion of southern gentility lay a darker realm, one not charted on maps nor acknowledged in polite conversation. It began past the last cotton row, where the soil turned coarse and the cypress trees grew thick around the edges of the plantation. Locals called it Hollow Creek's backwoods, but those who lived and labored on the land knew it by another name, the Land of Shadows. This was where the discarded were buried. The Chamberlains had built their empire on cotton, but that cotton was fertilized not just by the sweat of enslaved people, but by their deaths. The 73 graves were not arranged in any dignified order. No markers, no stones, no records. Just hollow depressions in the earth, scattered beneath trees that had grown over the years, their roots threading through bones. It wasn't a cemetery, it was a concealment. The plantation's overseer, a grim man named Harlan Finch, ensured the burials were done quietly and quickly. He kept no names, only numbers, scratched in the margins of a small leather-bound field book he never let out of his sight. Death was routine on the plantation, no more remarkable than the rain or the harvest, and Finch treated it as such. Fever, beatings, childbirth, starvation, suicide, all claimed lives. So the war only made things worse. With able-bodied men conscripted into service or lost to skirmishes, the burden on the enslaved grew crushing. Quotas doubled. Food was rationed. Punishments escalated. Some of the graves belonged to children, no older than 10, who had been worked as field hands, others to elders who collapsed mid-row and never rose again. One belonged to a woman named Annika, who resisted being forced back to work 2 days after childbirth. She was whipped until her back split open, then locked in a storage shed where she died of infection within days. Her newborn disappeared from the quarters that same night. No one asked questions. Asking questions was dangerous. And still the Chamberlains entertained visitors in their parlor, hosting garden parties with imported wines and hand-sewn gowns. As the war raged beyond the horizon, Hollow Creek held fast to its illusion of civility, its monstrous core carefully veiled behind etiquette and empire. The graves were not secrets because no one cared to look. They were hidden because the people buried there had never been seen as people at all. But within the quarters, memory endured. There was a ritual the enslaved began to follow, especially among the older women. On moonless nights, they would leave folded scraps of cloth near the tree line, symbols of mourning, each square sewn with crude symbols stitched by firelight. No voices were raised. There were no prayers that could be spoken aloud, only the silent testimony of hands. Over time, these cloth offerings became a quiet rebellion, a defiance of erasure. Each thread whispered a name: Solomon, Annika, Ruth's sister Lila, young Benjamin. Names that Finch never wrote. Names that Silas Chamberlain never knew. Names the ground could not forget. Miriam Chamberlain began to notice the scraps during her walks beyond the fields. She never touched them, only observed, sometimes pausing in front of them as if listening for something in the wind. There was something about the woods that unsettled her, not in fear, but in shame. She had asked her mother once why the woods were always off-limits. Her mother's answer had been crisp, final. That's where the land settles. It's not fit for cultivation. But Miriam knew better. The air shifted out there, heavy and mournful, thick with stories no one told in daylight. It was Ruth who finally told her the truth, not in full, but in enough fragments to make Miriam start writing it down, carefully, in the margins of her piano sheet music, in the seams of her journal pages, masked in poetic code. Ruth never pointed toward the graves. She didn't have to. Her silence guided Miriam more than words ever could. One night during a thunderstorm, a flash of lightning split the sky and revealed for the briefest second a line of shallow mounds beneath the trees. Miriam, standing at her bedroom window, saw them clearly. She knew then what Hollow Creek truly rested upon. Not land, not cotton, not legacy, but silence. Silence and graves. And the earth, heavy with what had been buried, was beginning to stir. Miriam Chamberlain was never meant to be a threat. She was the quiet daughter, the one who read too much and asked too little. While her brothers trained in law and land management, learning to guard the family's wealth and preserve its legacy, Miriam occupied the margins of Hollow Creek, the family's vast Tennessee estate, as though she were a guest rather than its heiress. But unlike her sibling, Miriam had the ability to see what they refused to. The rot beneath the gold, the pain in the silences, and the ghosts in the fields. She was born into privilege, yet from a young age it unsettled her. The luxury of their world, the silks, the crystal, the library full of European volumes, rested on the bent backs of those no one dared name. It was Ruth who gave her the first book that changed her, a tattered banned text by an abolitionist preacher, its spine split, the pages worn thin by many hands. Ruth had been taught to read in secret by her mother back when she was still a child working in the laundry house. Ruth was smart, too smart for the life she was forced into, and Miriam knew it. Their friendship began quietly, first in glances, then in murmured questions, until finally, in the pantry behind the main kitchen, truths were exchanged. Ruth never begged, she never pleaded. She simply told stories, described what happened behind the sugar house, near the creek, in the smokehouse after dark. Stories about beatings, miscarriages, hunger, hope. Miriam listened, horrified. Her hands trembled, and then she wrote. In her bedroom, hidden behind the armoire, Miriam began a journal. She wrote in a code only she understood, a cipher of Latin phrases and botanical references learned from her tutor. It was dangerous what she was doing, but once the words began to pour from her, they didn't stop. She recorded names, dates, punishments, the names of the dead when they could be found, whispers of the 73 unmarked graves. Rumors Ruth had heard confirmed by older field hands. The ledger Silas kept locked in his study. Miriam could never access it, but she wrote what she could glean from snippets of overheard conversation. Everything went into the journal. It became her second heartbeat. At night, she'd leave the window open and listen to the distant sounds of the quarters, the quiet weeping, the soft clatter of exhausted bodies falling onto hard wooden cots. She sometimes saw lantern lights moving in the woods, a hush of movement near the creek bed where the unmarked graves were said to be. Once she followed. She didn't get close. She knew she wasn't welcome there. But she saw them. Women kneeling in the dirt, hands pressed to the earth, humming, mourning without markers. That image stayed with her longer than any sermon or scripture. Her mother warned her, sensing something was wrong. "You look pale, girl," she said over breakfast one morning, "like you've seen spirits." Miriam only smiled. She had. They followed her through the house, in the glint of the chandelier, in the echo of laughter in rooms that had no business laughing, in the bloodstains faintly visible on the flagstone floor outside the smokehouse. Hollow Creek was alive with ghosts, and Miriam knew she was the only one writing their names down before they were lost forever. The war outside pressed in. Skirmishes crept closer to their land. Union soldiers were rumored to be just counties away, and while her brothers whispered of fortifying their holdings, Miriam wrote faster. Ruth told her of Elias, an escaped man who joined the Union forces, a man who once worked the Chamberlain fields. He had a memory like steel, Ruth said. Knew where the graves were. Knew what Silas had done. Miriam's hand froze on the page when she heard his name. She began writing letters, though she didn't send them. Letters addressed to no one, full of truth, guilt, and feverish urgency. Sometimes she feared discovery, but more than that, she feared silence. She could not destroy Hollow Creek. She knew that. The machine was too large, its gears too deep in the soil, but she could record it. Preserve the truth for a day when someone might dig it up. The journal would not save the dead, but it might damn the living. She hid it in a tin box beneath the loose floorboard of the East Wing's nursery, wrapped in oilcloth. Her heart beat differently after that, slower, heavier. She knew she had crossed the threshold. It was only a matter of time before the war reached their gates, and when it did, Miriam would not run. By the spring of 1863, as Union forces pressed deeper into Confederate territory, one man returned to Hollow Creek not as a servant, but as a witness. Elias, once an enslaved stable hand on the Chamberlain estate, had escaped 3 years prior under the cover of a thunderstorm. He'd been presumed dead by the family, another forgotten life among the many, but Elias had survived, walking north, hiding in abandoned barns, guided by whisper networks and sympathetic strangers until he reached Union lines. There he joined the 13th U.S. Colored Infantry Regiment. What the Chamberlains could never have anticipated was that Elias carried something far more dangerous than vengeance. He carried proof. During his escape, Elias had stolen a small, leather-bound ledger from the overseer's office, tucked inside a satchel beneath a pile of feed bags. At the time, he had barely known what it contained. He couldn't read, but he knew it mattered. The ledger was written in a tidy, formal script. Columns of names, dates, transactions, punishments, and cotton yields. What Elias held was no less than a map of the crimes committed at Hollow Creek. Sale prices for children separated from their mothers, notations of floggings administered for disobedience, coded entries indicating deaths dismissed as losses, and, most damningly, a line repeated 73 times in a shorthand used only by the overseer and Silas Chamberlain, our 13-upper to earth, no marker. As Elias made his way back to Tennessee with Union troops advancing, he entrusted the ledger to a chaplain named Horace Bellamy, who verified its contents and began cataloging names. Bellamy, a former lawyer turned abolitionist, understood the gravity of what had been found. It wasn't just a record. It was testimony. And in a war increasingly defined by moral reckoning, such testimony could alter how history remembered men like Silas Chamberlain. The timing of the return could not have been more precise. Union scouts had already targeted Hollow Creek as a potential supply point and suspected it of harboring Confederate sympathizers. The family, sensing the shift in momentum, had begun liquidating assets and preparing for a strategic withdrawal to Mississippi. But the arrival of Elias with Union backing turned a mere military raid into something far more profound. When Union soldiers entered the estate under General Whitlock's command, they did not just seize cotton stores or confiscate livestock. Under Elias's guidance, they searched the overseer's quarters, the storerooms, and the hidden compartments beneath the carriage house, where additional ledgers were discovered, some half-burned, others hidden beneath floorboards. What emerged was a mosaic of calculated brutality. Lists of enslaved children traded to settle debts, names of brokers, quantities of cotton exchanged for weapons, and even letters suggesting political favors exchanged with Confederate officers in exchange for safe passage through the blockades. But the most chilling discovery came when Elias led them beyond the fields, past the crumbling fence that had once marked the slave quarters and into the woods. There, beneath a thick canopy of pines, the ground sagged in soft indentations. The soldiers fanned out. Shovels struck shallow clay. Bones surfaced. 73 in total, some interred with bits of cloth, still clinging to their remains, others reduced to mere fragments. There were no markers, no names, just silence and earth. Word spread quickly. The Chamberlain name, once whispered with reverence in southern parlors and business circles, became a symbol of shame. Newspapers in the North published excerpts from the ledger. Abolitionist speakers carried Elias's story into churches, schools, and town halls. Miriam Chamberlain, left behind at the estate during the family's flight, watched as soldiers exhumed what her family had tried so hard to bury. She said nothing. She only handed over her journal, pages filled with her observations, sketches of faces long forgotten, the locations of the graves, and the names she had learned in whispers. Silas Chamberlain would never return to Hollow Creek. He escaped into the Confederacy, gold sewn into the lining of his coat. But his dynasty had been broken not by armies or bullets, but by truth, carved into paper and buried beneath soil. By the winter of 1864, the war had begun to shift. The Union Army, now better supplied and more resolute, had started to push deeper into Tennessee. Rumors spread like wildfire through backroads and slave quarters. Union soldiers were coming, and with them, the possibility of something long thought impossible: freedom. For the Chamberlains, the danger was no longer distant. Their well-maintained illusion of invincibility began to fray as neighboring estates were raided, and whispers of Union scouts passing through nearby counties reached even the deafest of ears within the Hollow Creek estate. But Hollow Creek had its own reckoning long before the soldiers arrived, in the form of a man who had once labored in its fields and nearly died beneath its lash. Elias, once enslaved and sold away as punishment for organizing secret prayer gatherings, had escaped north years before and joined a black regiment in the Union Army. Now he returned to Tennessee as a corporal, a uniformed soldier armed with more than a rifle. He carried a stolen ledger from the Chamberlain estate, smuggled out by Ruth, the same housemaid who had taught Miriam Chamberlain to read abolitionist pamphlets by candlelight. The ledger contained itemized records of purchases, punishments, and deaths, not of property, but of people. It was a book of blood written in the handwriting of Silas Chamberlain himself. With Elias guiding them, Union officers planned a coordinated raid. Their objective wasn't just to seize cotton or livestock. It was to expose the root of the Chamberlain fortune, the labor and lives it had consumed. On the morning of March 7th, 1864, under a gray and restless sky, the soldiers came. They rode in through the western road with banners lowered and boots soaked in mud. The overseers were the first to run, followed closely by Chamberlain's sons and distant cousins who had sought refuge in the estate during the war's final year. Silas stood his ground only long enough to set fire to his personal study, hoping to destroy any remaining evidence. But he hadn't accounted for Elias, who had already hidden the more damning pages. Miriam watched from her bedroom window as the estate crumbled around her. The grand halls were no match for gunpowder and justice. Furniture was dragged outside and burned. The cotton stores were confiscated. But it was what the soldiers found in the woods that shifted the tone from military action to quiet horror. Following Elias and two elderly former slaves, Union troops were led to the edge of the forest, to the dried creek bed cloaked in brush. There, beneath the tangled roots and years of silence, they began uncovering the first of the 73 graves. They did not dig them all. There wasn't time nor stomach for it. But the message was clear. The wealth of the Chamberlain family was not merely unethical, it was criminal. Each grave, each bone pulled from the soil, was a testimony. The story the South had tried to keep buried was rising into daylight. Word of the raid spread quickly. Journalists traveling with the Union troops filed dispatches to Northern papers, and within weeks, the Chamberlain name, once synonymous with elegance and Southern prestige, was instead etched into headlines as a symbol of aristocratic brutality. Still, the family had escaped. In the chaos of the raid, Silas, along with his surviving brothers, vanished into the backwoods with what remained of the family's gold, some jewels, and Miriam in tow. Where they went was never officially recorded, though scattered accounts in post-war diaries suggest they fled toward Mississippi, then on to Louisiana under assumed names. The estate burned for days. Local townspeople, many of whom had long resented the Chamberlains' dominance but feared their retribution, came to gawk at the smoldering ruins. Others, those who had once toiled in the fields or nursed scars from Chamberlain whips, came to weep, not out of sorrow for what was lost, but for what had never been mourned. Though the fire devoured much of Hollow Creek, the graves remained. Untouched by flame, unmarked by stone, they waited in silence beneath the scorched branches and blackened sky. Time would pass. Moss would grow. Trees would reclaim the edges. But even the deepest silence has a memory, and memory, like justice, never forgets. In the modern hills of Tennessee, where time had smoothed the jagged edges of war and wealth, the Chamberlain name still lingered like a whisper, a name carved into plaques, stitched into university wings, etched into town hall bricks. Yet few truly remembered what that name had once stood for. Fewer still had any interest in uncovering it. Generations had passed since Hollow Creek's cotton empire fell, and the mansion itself had long since collapsed into ruin, swallowed by vines and memory. But beneath the soil, where the forest pressed close and the creek barely trickled, the 73 unmarked graves remained, and now they had finally been found. It was a construction crew, contracted by the county to expand a 2-lane road through the Chamberlain Hill, that made the discovery. Digging machinery came to a sudden halt when workers unearthed human remains, not one body but several, shallow, scattered. The site was sealed, local authorities called in, and before long, a team of archaeologists and historians descended on the area. What they uncovered matched no known cemetery or recorded burial site. Instead, the findings, along with historical records, oral traditions from local black families, and whispers passed down through generations, began to tell a different story. A story that had lived in shadows for over 150 years. Among those who came forward was an elderly woman named Elsie Tate, descended from an enslaved man named Elias, once a field hand at Hollow Creek. Her family had preserved his story through careful oral tradition, a tale of a man who escaped, joined Union scouts, and returned to bear witness. She brought forward his name in a tattered page from a family Bible, written in delicate ink. Elias, son of Abram, buried none, remembered all. The line puzzled researchers at first, until the connection to Hollow Creek's graves became clear. At the center of this sudden reckoning stood Claire Chamberlain, the last living direct descendant of Silas Chamberlain. A successful litigation attorney in Nashville, she had never once set foot on the land her family once ruled. Her father, who died in silence and distance, left her only stories of Southern gentility, always carefully curated. The Chamberlain name, in her understanding, was tied to philanthropy, land, old institutions, and not much else. But with the graves came the questions, and the questions led directly to her. Claire found herself pulled into the heart of something older and more painful than she had ever imagined. Reporters called, activists protested, historians sought interviews. But none of it struck her quite like standing on that patch of forested soil where small red flags now marked the resting places of lives erased. She was escorted by a local historian, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Harold Kinney, who gently recounted the records of cotton yields in the overseer's ledgers, now held in a local museum archive, ledgers Claire's great-great-uncle had kept, each entry measured in pounds and names and punishments. Something inside her shifted. She began to read the journals of Miriam Chamberlain, her distant relative, whose personal writings had survived in an attic and were recently donated anonymously. In those pages, Claire found the only voice within her bloodline that had mourned the graves, Miriam, who had dared to describe the unmarked burials and cry out on paper in the only way she safely could. Claire read each entry like a confession, the edges of history cutting sharper with every page. And so, when the county held its public hearing to decide what to do with the land, it was Claire who stood before the microphone. Not as a lawyer, not as a descendant, desperate to preserve family legacy, but as a woman burdened by inheritance. She made her statement clearly. The land should be preserved, the graves properly honored, and the Chamberlain Foundation's remaining wealth, now her responsibility, redirected toward education, memorial, and reparative community work. She faced criticism, of course, from distant relatives, from old guard Southern loyalists, from wealthy benefactors who preferred legends over truth. But she stood firm, not out of guilt alone, but from an understanding that silence, when inherited, becomes complicity, and that legacy, if left unchallenged, becomes rot. The land was saved. A memorial was built, not grand but sacred. Each name that could be traced was etched into stone. For those whose names were lost to time, symbols of cotton and crossed hands marked their place. And nearby, under the shade of hickory trees, stood a bronze plaque engraved with Miriam Chamberlain's words, "If I am to call this home, I must first learn the names of the forgotten." The Chamberlain name, for the first time in a century and a half, no longer belonged to silence.